July 1943. The wind blows gently over the vast plains of the Soviet Union, raising clouds of dust that dance in the orange light of dawn. The dry grass sways as if sensing what is to come, the greatest tank battle the world would ever see. In the distance, the deep roar of engines begins to fill the air. Hundreds of German tanks, Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IV are arranged in perfect rows, like steel beasts awaiting the final command. Their hooves gleam in the rising sun, reflecting the gold of the morning and the red of the coming war. The crewmen, young and exhausted, wipe the dust from their helmets and check their weapons for the last time. Some murmur soft prayers, others simply stare at the horizon, where they know thousands of Soviets await them, ready to kill or be killed. Inside one of the command towers, a German officer holds a crumpled map in sweaty hands. He knows what it represents: Operation Citadel, Hitler's last attempt to regain control of the Eastern Front. If we fail, here, he thinks, the war will be lost. Hitler had gambled everything. After the defeats at Stalingrad and the Caucasus, he wanted to erase the shame and prove that the Wehrmacht was still invincible. His plan was simple and brutal: to crush the Kursk salient in a pincer attack from the north and south and destroy the Soviet forces trapped in the middle. It was the masterstroke that, in his mind, would change the course of the war. But the Führer didn't know that the Soviets were already expecting him. Stalin and the Red High Command had deciphered the plan weeks earlier, through spies and interceptions. In secret, they transformed Kursk into a colossal fortress. For miles and miles, they dug deep trenches, installed more than 1 million landmines, and positioned anti-tank missiles and camouflaged cannons. It was a deadly web, ready to devour any army that dared to cross it. As the sun slowly rises in the sky, the heat begins to spread. The smell of oil and gasoline fills the air. German crews tighten their belts, engines roar in unison, and a metallic vibration ripples through the ground. The sound is eerie, like the awakening of a gigantic beast. Across the lines, Soviet soldiers watch the horizon from their trenches. They hear the sound of engines and exchange silent glances. Many tremble, but no one retreats. A Soviet commander, standing on the parapet, raises his binoculars and whispers, "They are coming." And in that instant, as the sun reaches its peak and the countryside is bathed in a golden glow, the peace of dawn is shattered. The air seems to hold its breath. In seconds, that calm, silent place will transform into a hell of fire, steel, and blood. The first act of the battle that will decide the fate of the Eastern Front. The dawn is over, now it begins. The day the world would burn in Kursk, blown away by Kursk. Comment your most shocking moment and subscribe for more epic battles. As the German engines roar and the ground begins to shake under the weight of the tanks, the real trap is already set, and Stalin awaits the enemy with a cold smile. He knows exactly what's coming. Months before that dawn, crucial information reached the Kremlin. Soviet spies embedded in Berlin, along with radio intercepts, revealed Hitler's plan to attack the Kursk salient and cut the Red forces in two. It was a risky move, typical of a desperate man. But Stalin, this time, would not repeat the mistake of Stalingrad. Instead of attacking first, he ordered, "Let them come to us, and then we will crush them." General Zhukov, the same hero who defended Moscow, was the mastermind behind the strategy. His idea was to turn Kursk into a trap of steel and mud. During 7 weeks, more than 300,000 civilians and soldiers, they worked day and night digging, fortifying, and installing defenses. Every hill, every field, every road was covered with mines and barbed wire. It was as if the land itself had become a Soviet weapon, and these weren't just trenches. They were in 9 lines of defense, one behind the other, stretching for more than 500 kilometers. Picture this: anti-tank ditches, explosive pits, camouflaged machine gun nests, and heavy artillery hidden under branches and tarps. Every inch of the terrain was designed to delay, confuse, and destroy the enemy. In the skies, the Red Air Force was rising again. In the forests, entire tank divisions T-34 waited in camouflage, silent as predators. And below ground, sleeping among mines and wires, were the Soviet soldiers, covered in mud, exhausted, but determined to resist. They knew they had nowhere to run. Behind them was only Moscow. When Soviet commanders observe the German advance through binoculars, there is no panic. There is only anticipation. They wait for the right moment to turn the battlefield into a mass grave. A Russian captain, covered in dirt up to his eyes, looks at his men and mutters, "Today, comrades, we are not fighting for Stalin. We are fighting for our homes, for our families, for every child the Nazis burned." Behind the lines, the Red Artillery awaits the order. The gunners' sweaty fingers rest on the triggers. Observers shout coordinates. The radio crackles. And then, at 2 in the morning of the day, July 5th, 1943, before the Germans can even fire the first shot, the whole sky explodes. Thousands of Soviet guns open fire simultaneously, unleashing a roar that echoes for miles. Flames illuminate the night, as if all hell has broken loose beneath Kursk. Bombs rain down on the German columns, destroying stationary tanks, setting trucks ablaze, knocking out radios and killing sleeping drivers. The German soldiers wake up in the chaos, dazed, their ears ringing and the smell of gunpowder choking the air. The officers run, shouting orders, trying to reorganize their ranks. But the surprise is total. Operation Citadel, which was supposed to be Nazi Germany's lightning strike, begins sunder enemy fire. And at that moment, the fate of the battle changes before the first tank even advances. Stalin's trap had closed. Tigers, Panthers, and German-pride Soviet artillery fire was still echoing when, on the horizon, the deepest and most terrifying roar of the entire war began. It wasn't thunder. They were engines, hundreds of them. From the midst of the smoke and dust emerged the steel monsters of the Third Reich. The new tanks, Tiger and Panther, the pride of German engineering, advanced in formation. Their tracks crushed the ground, their turrets rotated slowly, and their 88mm guns, capable of piercing any Soviet armor, pointed eastward, ready to kill. Each tank weighed more than 50 tons, a mobile fortress with steel plates so thick that bullets bounced off like stones off a wall. The Tiger the Rhone, feared and revered, was the symbol of the Nazi war machine, majestic, deadly, and seemingly invincible. And beside you, the Panther, faster and more modern, was the new predator of the battlefield. Hitler believed that these two giants would be his secret weapon, the blow that would break the Red Army once and for all. As the tanks roar, officers like von Manstein and Walter Model, they watch the advance with binoculars in hand. They believe in the power of the Blitzkrieg, that lightning war that years before had conquered half of Europe. For them, Kursk would be just another glorious victory, but something was wrong. The terrain was unfavorable. Gentle hills, minefields, and thick mud made advance difficult. Dry dust mixed with smoke, obscuring vision. Every few meters, the tanks had to stop, clean their tracks, and adjust their engines, and the enemy still didn't appear. Inside the Tigers, the heat was unbearable. The crews sweated in silence. The sound of gears mingled with the smell of oil and burning metal. Suddenly a bang, boom, and an explosion ahead. A Tiger is hit by a mine and thrown into the air, falling in pieces of fire and steel. The radio crackles, orders mix with panic. Mines ahead, retreat, retreat. But retreating is not an option. The Panthers advance, cutting a path through craters and debris. Their tracks crush indistinguishable bodies and debris. A Soviet cannon hidden in the trees fires, blame, and hits one of the tanks in the flank. The impact rips off the entire turret, launching it into the air like a pot lid. Still, the Germans push on. The Soviet fire increases, but the power of the German guns is devastating. Each Tiger shot destroys a T-34 over a kilometer away. Wheat fields burn. The sky is covered in black smoke. And even in the face of hell, German pride does not waver. Commanders believe their tanks are indestructible, that nothing can resist their engineering. But what they don't realize yet is that technical superiority will not overcome numbers nor Soviet cunning. Hitler's giants, shining brightly earlier in the day, are beginning to show their weaknesses. They break down, they overheat, their transmissions freeze. Some are abandoned by their own desperate crews as the ground vibrates with explosions and the sky fills with smoke and screams. And there, amidst the chaos, a German sergeant watches his Tiger sit idle, its engine dead, as the sound of Soviet artillery approaches. He mutters, his face covered in soot. They knew we were coming. German pride still advances, but the Kursk Cauldron is already starting to boil. Enjoyed the story? Leave a comment and subscribe to keep traveling through history's bloodiest battlefields. The clock ticks 2. In the morning, the sky is still black and fog creeps over the cold ground. German soldiers prepare for the attack, adjusting their sights, fueling their tanks, cleaning their periscope lenses. Everything seems too quiet. And then, suddenly, all hell breaks loose. On the Soviet side, a voice shouts into a radio, "Fire!" and the whole world explodes. More than 2,000 artillery pieces, Soviet artillery fires simultaneously. The ground shakes as if alive, cracking under the force of the detonations. The sky lights up with red flashes, like hellish lightning. Each explosion sends debris, mud, and bodies flying. The German offensive, planned to begin at dawn, is crushed before it even takes its first step. Tank columns catch fire, fuel trucks turn into fireballs, and night turns to day. German soldiers run in despair, shouting for orders, stumbling over craters, trying to escape the rain of steel. Some throw themselves to the ground, covering their heads as shrapnel slices through, the air like blades. The officers try to regain control, shouting over the deafening noise, "Forward! Forward!" And miraculously, the tanks begin to move. The Wehrmacht lines reorganize amidst the chaos. The tracks spin, crushing the still smoldering wreckage. The sound is a collective roar, iron, fire, and fury. The sun begins to rise. A golden glow appears behind the black smoke, and the Kursk field takes on color, the gray of metal, the red of blood, and the orange of flames. Dust rises, thick as fog, blinding the men and muffling their screams. Now the German offensive truly begins. The 9th Army in the north and the 4th Panzer Army in the south advance toward the Soviet defenses. The entire battlefront moves, a living wall of steel and destruction. The guns fire relentlessly, blasting craters into the ground and tearing apart anything that moves. But what they expected to be a glorious march turns into a journey through hell. Every kilometer conquered is paid for with dozens of destroyed tanks. The Soviet defenses seemed endless: trenches, mines, ditches, ambushes. And every time a Tiger advanced, it was met with a hail of grenades and anti-tank fire. A German commander watches the scene from inside his tank and mutters to the radio operator, "It's like fighting against the ground itself." The Soviets, entrenched and silent, wait for the enemy to get close, and then open fire with all their might. Anti-tank guns ZIS-3. They fire from hidden positions. The sound is dry, violent. T-34s emerge from the hills, fire and retreat before the Tigers can rotate their turrets. Every shot is a deadly duel. The dust, heat, and noise are suffocating. The field is filled with smoke, debris, and bodies. Men run in flames. Entire crews are charred inside tanks that have become metal furnaces. The grass burns, the air stinks of iron and flesh. Still, the Germans follow. Every man, every machine, driven by a mixture of fear and blind obedience. At the top of a hill, the sun finally breaks through, and what it reveals is a Dantesque vision. The largest tank attack in human history had just begun. And in that deafening dawn, one thing became clear to both sides. No one would leave Kursk the same. The wall of fire, The sun was already high, and the Kursk field, once golden and silent, was now a moving inferno. The heat made the air shimmer above the ground. Dust mixed with smoke, and the sound of engines was constant, deafening. German tanks advanced, spitting fire, cutting a path through the destruction. But every meter conquered came with the bitter taste of death. Ahead of them, the Soviets had built a real wall of fire. It was impossible to see where the trenches ended and the mines began. Every step, every treadmill could be the last. The tanks T-34 Soviets, lighter and more agile, appeared like shadows in the smoke. They didn't attack head-on, they attacked by the flanks, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. They fired and retreated rapidly, confusing the Sur Tigers, forcing them to rotate their heavy, slow turrets. The mines were beginning to do their work. A dry crash. Boom! And a Panther is launched into the air. The tracks come loose, the tank tilts, and seconds later a grenade hits the side, turning the interior into a furnace. Inside, the screams are short. The fire consumes everything. The Soviets had transformed the terrain into a patiently prepared cemetery. Russian artillerymen, camouflaged among bushes, fired relentlessly. Machine guns uncrackled. Anti-tank guns thundered from behind logs and craters. Each shot shakes the ground. Each explosion raises a curtain of mud, dust, and blood. The Germans respond with fury. The Tiger's 80mm guns rip holes in the defenses, ripping out entire chunks of ground and men. The panzers advance in formation, spitting fire in all directions, and behind them, the infantry struggles to keep up, stumbling over debris and mutilated bodies. The air is so thick with smoke that it's impossible to breathe without coughing. Vision is almost non-existent, shadows and glare. A German soldier shouts, his face covered in soot, "We can't see them, they're underground!" And indeed they were. The Soviets dug layered trenches with tunnels and underground shelters. Some German tanks run over soldiers who are still alive, waiting for the order to leave. As the artillery reloads, the Russians leap from the pits, throwing grenades directly at the tank's tracks. The explosion rips off metal and limbs. The floor is a grotesque mixture of iron, mud, and flesh. Every advance costs dozens of lives. Every hill conquered is lost minutes later, overrun by desperate counterattacks. But no one backs down, neither the Germans nor the Soviets. The Germans continue to force their way through, as if they could break hell by force. The Soviets continue to resist, as if the very soil of Kursk were alive and willing to die with them. And when the sun sets, the entire countryside looks like an ocean on fire. Destroyed tanks still burn, illuminating the night with orange flames. The crows begin to land. Silence slowly returns, broken only by the crack of hot metal. But that was just the first day, and the battle was still far from over. The Germans believed they were through the worst. They didn't know what awaited them ahead would be the true Cauldron, the point where war would swallow everything and everyone. Which side would you have chosen at Kursk? Comment below and subscribe to discover more tales of courage and carnage. It is the dawn of July 12th, 1943. The sky is still shrouded in dense fog, and the smell of gasoline, gunpowder, and burning flesh permeates the air. The Kursk field, already a ruin, is now the stage for something even greater, the moment when tank warfare reaches the height of human brutality. The name of the place will be remembered forever. Prokhorovka. There, in a space of just a few kilometers, two colossal armies prepare to collide. On one side, the 4th Panzer Army of von Manstein, leading more than 700 German tanks, among them the feared Tigers and Panthers. On the other hand, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, under the command of the General Rotmistrov, with but 800 T-34 San self-propelled guns. The sound of the engines is deafening. The ground trembles as if the world itself breathes in fear. The Soviet crews cross themselves inside their tanks. The Germans adjust their sights. And then, as the sun begins to break through the smoke, the giants advance. There is no subtlety, no refined strategy. It is pure and direct collision. Soviet tanks descend from the hills in tight formation, speeding toward the enemy. The entire field moves, a swarm of raging steel. The sound of the tracks is like thunder. Suddenly, the two forces meet. The impact is apocalyptic. T-34s collide head-on with Tigers. Cannons fire at close range. Shrapnel rips through the air. Men scream inside burning hulls. The ground is engulfed in flames and molten metal. It's impossible to tell who's who. It's as if hell itself has descended on Earth. A T-34 hits a Tiger in the flank. The shot ricochets harmlessly. The Tiger slowly rotates its turret and fires back. The shell passes through the T-34 like paper, exploding the tank in a fireball. But another T-34, coming from the side, rams into the Tiger, crushing both. Crews burn to death, trapped in their own vehicles. The field becomes a boiling cauldron, a sea of smoke, iron, and blood. The heat is unbearable. Dust covers everything. Visibility is almost zero. But the tanks continue firing in the dark, guided only by the flashes of enemy gunfire. In the midst of this chaos, General Rotmistrov, observing from an outpost, shouts over the radio, "Attack! Break their lines! Die if necessary, but advance!" And they move forward. The Soviets never seem to stop. Even with hundreds of tanks destroyed, new waves keep emerging. It's a living wall of steel and sacrifice. The Germans, despite their technical superiority, are beginning to be swallowed up by numbers and madness. A Soviet soldier, trapped in his burning T-34, opens the hatch and jumps out. But before he touches the ground, an explosion hurls him through the air. Another tank rumbles over the wreckage, crushing bodies and metal. For hours, the field is consumed by fire. The flames mix with smoke, the air is unbreathable, and the noise is so loud that the soldiers' ears ring even after the explosions have stopped. When the sun sets, Prokhorovka field is unrecognizable. Charred bodies, twisted towers, smoking tanks and craters everywhere. Neither side can say they won, but both know something has changed forever. Kursk had become the symbol of modern warfare, a place where men and machines merged into one thing: destruction. And as smoke rises into the sky, a Soviet commander surveys the wreckage and says in a low voice, "They wanted to surround us, but they ended up trapped in the cauldron itself." The meeting of the Titans, the apocalypse. In Prokhorovka, dawn had barely broken over the vast Russian steppe, but the Kursk skyline was already tinged with dense blackness, a shroud of smoke and ash rising into the sky, foreshadowing the inferno unfolding below. The Prokhorovka field, once a monotonous expanse of grass and earth, had been transfigured into a lunar landscape, a desolate mosaic of craters opened by the fury of artillery, the twisted hulks of tanks smoking like monuments to destruction, and the charred bodies of men, silent witnesses to an unprecedented carnage. Yet, amid this apocalyptic desolation, the battle, far from over, was reaching its climax. The remnants of both armies, exhausted and scarred by the brutality of combat, faced each other across a landscape that seemed like the very embodiment of the end of time. The clash of the Titans, the definitive collision of two unstoppable forces, was about to take place. On one side advanced the Wehrmacht's steel colossuses, the German Tigers and Panthers. These war machines were veritable mobile fortresses, heavily armored with steel plates ranging from 80 to 120 millimeters thick at the front, making them nearly invulnerable to many Soviet projectiles of the time. Their 80 millimeters in the case of the Tiger and long-barreled 75 millimeter missiles in the Panther guns were capable of piercing enemy armor at long ranges, giving them a devastating tactical advantage. They were majestic in their imposing appearance, symbols of German military engineering, but also slow and complex to manufacture and maintain, which limited their numbers on the battlefield. Each of these tanks represented a colossal investment in resources and technology, and their presence inspired both awe and respect. On the other side, surging in relentless waves, came the Soviet T-34s. In contrast to German sophistication, the T-34 was the embodiment of rugged simplicity and brutal effectiveness. With its sloped armor, which increased protection against projectiles, and its 76mm and later 85mm gun, the T-34 was fast, agile, and above all, mass-produced in numbers the Germans could never match. They were piloted by men who, after years of war and suffering, had transcended fear, transforming themselves into an unrelenting force, driven by fierce patriotism and a burning desire to repel the invader. With each T-34 destroyed, two more seemed to emerge from the smoke, an inexhaustible torrent of steel and fury. This was the height of mechanized warfare, not just a clash of machines, but a deadly dance between cutting-edge technology and human desperation. German radio, once an efficient communication channel, now buzzed with a cacophony of urgent orders and desperate cries. "Advance! Push the Russians back!" an SS officer shouted, his voice distorted by static and the urgency of the situation. But the order was useless. The Soviets, with an almost supernatural resilience, did not retreat. They emerged from the thick smoke, the newly opened craters, the smoking wreckage of their own comrades, a red tide that seemed to spring from the scorched ground itself, a legion of ghosts and warriors reborn from the ashes. The sound of battle was a hellish symphony that rent the air. Anti-tank guns fired incessantly, their dry, thunderous booms echoing across the steppe. The frenzied crackle of machine guns, a continuous and terrifying sound, mingled with the agonized screams of pain from the wounded and the guttural roars of engines strained to the limit of their endurance. Each explosion was a column of fire that rose to the sky, a momentary flash of light that illuminated the darkness of the smoke. The air vibrated with the impact of thousands of shells, and the ground beneath the soldiers' feet seemed to tremble incessantly, shaken by the colossal weight of hundreds of tons of steel in motion, colliding and destroying each other. In an instant of shocking brutality, a German Tiger fired its 80mm cannon. The projectile, a dart of incandescent metal, tore through a T-34 like paper, exploding it in a ball of fire and shrapnel. The crew, if they had time to realize what had happened, was vaporized in the blink of an eye. But the Tiger's victory was fleeting. Before the German crew could even think about reloading, 3 T-34s, like ravenous wolves, converged on it. One fired at point-blank range, hitting the track and immobilizing the giant. Another, with desperate precision, hit the turret, jamming it. The third T-34, perhaps out of ammunition or driven by suicidal desperation, accelerated at top speed, transforming itself into a living battering ram, and collided head-on with the Tiger. The resulting explosion was brutal, a cataclysm of metal and fire that shook the entire field. The Tiger and the T-34, locked in their mutual destruction, disappeared in a ball of fire and a shower of shrapnel, a sacrifice that symbolized the ferocity of that confrontation. From above, to a distant observer, the Prokhorovka scene resembled a battle of fallen gods, a hellish landscape where the titans of war were shattered. Tanks burned like giant torches, their flames licking the sky, their dark silhouettes dancing against the grey backdrop of smoke. Crews, trapped in their burning metal traps, tried to escape, rolling in the mud and earth, only to be engulfed by the merciless flames. The smell of burning diesel fuel, gunpowder and charred flesh dominated everything. A nauseating fragrance that lingered in the clothes and memories of the survivors. Soviet soldiers, with unwavering determination, advanced through the rubble, their machine guns strapped to their shoulders, firing continuous bursts while shouting, "Hoo! Hoo! Hoo!" a battle cry that was both a challenge and a plea. Some fell before even reaching their targets, torn to shreds by shrapnel or machine gun fire. Others, however, reached the German tanks, climbing over their hot hulls and throwing grenades into the open hatches, transforming mechanized, a warfare into hand-to-hand combat, a visceral struggle where steel, fire and desperation merged into a single terrifying reality. On the German side, Chaos was utter, and the once rigid discipline was beginning to crumble. The radios, once channels of clear orders, were now silent or filled with static and screams of panic. The dense smoke and dust kicked up by the explosions completely blocked vision, transforming the battlefield into a deadly maze. The commander of a panther, his face covered in soot and blood, surveyed the destruction around him, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief. Muttering to himself, his voice hoarse and broken, he uttered the words that would echo in the memory of many. Das ist die Hölle. This is hell. And he was not wrong. Prokhorovka was indeed hell on earth. Within hours, the Prokhorovka field was transformed into a vast graveyard of machines, a testament to the ferocity of that day. More than 500 tanks from both sides were destroyed in a single day, a number never to be equaled in any other mechanized confrontation in history. The Battle of Kursk, and especially the engagement at Prokhorovka, was not won by superior technique or impeccable strategy, but rather by the incalculable sacrifice and indomitable courage of Soviet soldiers, by their ability to forge ahead, even when the fire devoured them, even when death was certain. When night finally fell, bringing with it a silence almost as heavy as the deafening noise that had preceded it, the survivors on both sides remained silent. The shock and horror of what they had witnessed and experienced were indescribable. The ground still smoked, exuding the acrid smell of destruction. The stars, indifferent to the human tragedy, were reflected in the pools of oil and blood that covered the field, a somber mirror of the devastation. The Battle of Kursk, in that decisive moment, had sealed the fate of the war in the East. The Germans would never again attack with the same force and impetus. The Nazi Empire, mortally wounded, began to bleed, a slow and inexorable bleeding that would lead to its final annihilation. The Red counterattack. The tide turns and the beginning of the end of the Wehrmacht in the East. The day after the carnage of Prokhorovka dawned on a battlefield that seemed to have been swept by an apocalypse. The smoke, though thinner, still hung like a shroud over the desolate landscape, blending with the sepulchral silence that followed the fury of battle. The cold winds of the Russian steppe blew incessantly, howling over the wreckage, melted and twisted tanks, broken and scattered weapons, and the swollen, unrecognizable bodies of thousands of men who lay in grotesque positions, mute witnesses to the unspeakable violence. The air, heavy and fetid, still smelled of hot metal, gunpowder, and most disturbingly, burning flesh, an odor that lingered in the nostrils and souls of the few survivors. Yet from the midst of that apocalyptic landscape where death had danced its most macabre waltz, a new sound began to grow, a distant roar that gradually turned into thunder. The sound of engines, hundreds of them approaching. It wasn't the Germans whose machines were in shambles and whose crews were exhausted and demoralized. It was the Soviets, and they were coming in droves, a red torrent that promised to sweep away everything in its path. The Red Army had waited patiently for precisely this strategic moment, the instant when the Germans, exhausted by the offensive, without fuel for their tanks and vehicles, without significant reinforcements to fill the gaps in their lines, and with their supporting artillery exhausted or destroyed, finally stopped advancing. Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great gamble in the East, had failed in its objective of crushing the Kursk salient and annihilating the Soviet forces. Now, the initiative had shifted. It was time to strike back, with everything they had, with a fury bolstered by years of invasion, suffering, and incalculable losses. Soviet radios, previously silent or filled with code, now echoed with swift, incisive orders, delivered with a clarity that inspired both fear and determination. Advance! Not a step back! Drive the invader back to the hell from whence he came. And as if the very soil of Mother Russia answered the call, hundreds of T-34 and KV-1 tanks, reinforced with new models and fresh crews, appeared on the horizon, emerging from the morning mist and the dust, kicked up by their tracks, Behind them, in impressive formation, came endless columns of infantry, trucks carrying supplies and troops, mobile artillery of every caliber, and, hovering low overhead, squadrons of fighters and bombers, ready to attack anything that moved and sported a black cross. The Soviet war machine, which had absorbed the initial German blow, now rose to launch its own devastating counterattack. The Germans, caught off guard by the ferocity and scale of the Soviet response, barely had time to react. Logistics, already an Achilles heel for the Wehrmacht on the vast eastern front, had collapsed. Damaged tanks, many still with wounded or trapped crews inside, were left behind, abandoned to their fate. Ammunition was running low, fuel depots were empty, and supply lines stretched to their limits and constantly attacked by Soviet aviation and guerrillas had been cut. The once orderly retreat quickly turned into a desperate, every-man-for-himself flight amidst the chaos. The Soviet advance was like an unstoppable red wave, sweeping away everything in its path. Wheat fields, once golden and ready for harvest, became seas of fire as heavy artillery opened up, firing incendiary and explosive shells. Each explosion sent up columns of earth, smoke and debris, creating an artificial inferno that engulfed the German positions. Each shot echoed with the fury of a people who swore revenge for every village burned, every family executed, every tear shed since the 1941 invasion. This wasn't just a military matter, it was bloody retribution, a reckoning for unspeakable crimes. Il-2 Sturmovik fighter bombers, nicknamed the Black Death by the Germans for their robust silhouette and devastating ground attack capability, swept the sky, diving down on retreating enemy columns, firing rockets and strafing retreating vehicles with their 23mm cannons. They turned the roads into death traps. Trucks caught fire, tanks burst into flames, and soldiers ran desperately into the bush, only to be mercilessly hunted by Soviet snipers who operated with lethal precision and a thirst for revenge. Terror spread through the German ranks, who watched their comrades being decimated from the sky and the ground. Amid the deafening chaos, a Russian commander, his voice hoarse but firm, shouted over the radio, his order echoing throughout the front: "Let not a single one of them escape. Let the ground of Kursk be their grave." And the order was carried out with brutal precision and relentless determination. The Soviets advanced relentlessly, giving no quarter to the retreating enemy. Each recaptured village was celebrated with shots fired into the air, shouts of joy, and, paradoxically, tears of fury and sadness. They encountered the ruins of the German lines, and what they saw filled them with rage and horror. Bodies of Soviet prisoners summarily executed, peasants hanged in public squares, houses burned to the ground, fields devastated. Now the war was no longer merely military. It was personal, a crusade to expel the invader and avenge the dead. With every kilometer, the Germans retreated, their resistance crumbling. Communications broke down. Generals called for reinforcements that never came, as German strategic reserves were depleted and the focus of the war had shifted. The soldiers, starving, terrified and demoralized, threw down their weapons and fled on foot, desperately trying to escape the hell that pursued them and the Soviets. And kept coming, day and night, relentless, relentless. The tide had turned, and the Red Army's strength was relentless. The red columns advanced on the remnants of the Wehrmacht, pushing it back westward to the positions from which they had started. Within days, the entire German front collapsed, turning the offensive into a chaotic and disastrous retreat. Hitler, at his headquarters, received the news with fury and despair, his megalomania confronted with the harsh reality of defeat. Operation Citadel, his last great gamble in the East, had turned into an irreversible disaster, a turning point that would seal the fate of the war. The elite of the German army, the world's most feared panzer divisions, such as the Leibstandarte SS, Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, were now nothing but ash, tusks, and twisted metal strewn across the fields of Kursk, their crews decimated and their morale shattered. The Soviet counterattack not only saved the Eastern Front, it decisively changed the course of World War II. From Kursk onward, the strategic initiative in the east passed permanently to Soviet hands, and the Wehrmacht would be in continuous retreat until the end of the war. And as the Red Army marched over the ruins of the Nazi dream of domination, a new feeling began to grow among the soldiers, the certainty that after so much blood, pain and sacrifice, final victory was near, and that the price paid at Kursk had not been in vain. The Battle of Kursk was not just a military victory. It was a moral victory, a symbol of Soviet resilience and a harbinger of the final defeat of the Third Reich. German withdrawal and Hitler's party pride. What was once the most feared army in the world was now retreating, in silence, in disorder, and covered in shame. The powerful tank, once a symbol of invincibility, were now smoking carcasses abandoned on the fields of Kursk. The dust raised by the German troops was no longer of advance, it was of withdrawal. On the destroyed roads, whole columns of soldiers marched westward, aimlessly, exhausted, hungry, dragging their feet in the mud. Damaged vehicles were left behind. Many tanks were still ablaze, illuminating the night with an ominous glow, like torches marking the path of defeat. The officers tried to maintain order. "Retreat in formation, regroup in the next line," they shouted. But no one listened anymore. The soldiers' confidence in the promises of victory died in Kursk, which was now a graveyard of iron and men. On the Dan radio, the desperate tone of the German transmissions revealed the chaos. "We have lost contact with the southern flank. We need fuel immediately. The Russians are everywhere." Hitler, at his headquarters in East Prussia, exploded in fury upon hearing the news. He wouldn't accept defeat. He couldn't believe that his last bet in the East had been destroyed in just a few days. He accused the generals of cowardice. He called the commanders traitors, but the truth was different. There was nothing more that could be done. The Soviets had turned Kursk into a meat grinder, a cauldron of steel and blood that swallowed up the best German divisions. The Tigers and Panthers, which were supposed to decide the war, lay burned and blown out, while the Soviet T-34s continued to advance, triumphant. Troop morale plummeted. Veteran soldiers, men who had marched from France to Stalingrad, now walked with their heads bowed, their eyes empty. They knew that the dream of victory was dead. And, worse, they knew that from that moment on, all that was left was to fight to survive. Meanwhile, Stalin received the news in Moscow with coldness and a rare smile. Kursk was not just a military victory, it was a symbol. The Soviet Union had proved to the world that it could not only resist, but beat the Nazi monster at its own game. From that moment on, the initiative for war changed hands. The German generals knew what this meant. The Soviet army was now in control, and time was working against Germany. Russian industry was producing tanks and weapons at a dizzying pace. Each dead man was replaced by another. Every destroyed village was rebuilt with anger and purpose. In the field, the Soviets continued to advance, crushing any resistance. The Red soldiers, once defensive, now marched with fury, every step a revenge, every shot a reckoning. And as the German army retreated, Hitler became increasingly isolated, surrounded by maps, illusions, and meaningless orders. He denied reality, believing that a new miracle would come, that the gods of war still favored him. But the gods of Kursk had spoken, and what they said was clear. The Third Reich bled to death. Hitler's pride had been shattered along with his tanks on the Russian plains. From then on, Germany would never attack in the east again. She would simply retreat, step by step, village by village, until Berlin became the final battlefield. Kursk was not just a defeat. He was the mortal wound who condemned the Nazi Empire. The ashes of Kursk, the field of the dead and the price of victory. The wind blows lightly over the Kursk plains. There are no more shots. There are no more screams. Just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. which covers the field like a sheet of mourning. The ground is strewn with debris. Twisted tanks, still smoking, rise like iron monuments amid the mud. Broken weapons, crushed helmets, pieces of uniforms, and bodies. Bodies everywhere. Some still sit inside the tanks, hands rigid on the controls, eyes open, frozen in the moment of death. Others lie scattered across the field, mixed with earth and steel, unrecognizable, melted by the explosion. The color of the soil has changed. It's red, drenched in blood, oil and rain. The smell is unbearable. Gasoline, gunpowder, burning flesh, smoke and decomposition. For days on end, the air of Kursk has carried the stench of war, the smell of victory and death mingled. The Soviets walk among the rubble, silent. Some search for missing, or friends. Others just watch. There is pride, yes, but also sadness. Victory came, but the price was monstrous. A young Russian soldier finds the body of a comrade. He recognizes him by the scarf around his neck. He kneels down, wipes his soot-covered face and murmurs, "You did it, comrade! We won!" But his voice fails and he weeps silently. Further on, engineers try to clear the mines and collect the wounded. There are moans everywhere. Men without legs, without eyes, with their bodies covered. In burns, some ask for water, others just ask to die. And among the ruins, the local peasants begin to return. They look at their villages, or what's left of them. Burned out houses, ruined churches, contaminated wells, but they come back because that is still their home. They dig, they clean, they build, because this is what remains after hell. Start over. On the other side, the Germans also count their dead. The once proud ranks are now made up of ghosts. Many of the bodies will never be identified. Kursk swallowed almost 500,000 men between dead, injured and missing. Neither side emerged unscathed. The Nazi eagles, once emblazoned on tanks, are now covered in soot. The Soviets hoist the red flag over the wreckage, not in celebration, but in remembrance. Because there, in Kursk, victory had the face of pain. The crows make the rounds. Twilight covers the countryside, and the flames still glow faintly on the horizon. The distant sound of a Soviet harmonica echoes, sad, drawn out, almost like a prayer for those left behind. Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, was over. But war? No. The world would still see Stalingrad, Leningrad, Berlin, and more seas of blood before the nightmare came to an end. But from then on, something has changed forever. The Red Army learned that it could defeat the most feared enemy on earth. And Germany learned that, even with all its war machine, could not defeat a people willing to die standing. The sun sets over Kursk, painting the sky red. It's not just a reflection of the flames, it's a symbol of a new time. The time when the Nazi Empire began to fall. The echo of steel, how Kursk changed the fate of the war. The sound of battle had ceased, but the echo of steel still echoed throughout Europe. Kursk was not just a victory, it was a watershed of eras. There, on the scorched plains of Russia, the Third Reich began to die, not suddenly, but slowly, like a wounded colossus bleeding to death. Until then, the world feared the German army, the Panzers, the Stukas, the legendary generals. Everything seemed invincible. But after Kursk, this aura broke. The soldiers who had once marched confidently now looked over their shoulders. The officers, once arrogant, now discussed how to survive, not how to win. On the Soviet side, morale reached its peak. Stalin knew that Kursk was more than a tactical victory. It was the symbol of the rebirth of the Red Army. He sent a message to his generals. Now the world knows that Hitler's machine can be broken. From today on, we move forward, always forward, and they advanced. After Kursk, the initiative changed hands never to return. Soviet forces began a series of devastating offensives: Orel, Smolensk, Kiev, Minsk, each one pushing the Germans further and further westward like an unstoppable avalanche. Soviet factories hidden in the Urals worked day and night. T-34 tanks rolled off the assembly lines by the thousands, while Il-2 and Yak-9 fighters dominated the sky. The Red Army, previously on the defensive, was now a colossal hammer. Germany, once the Forge of Terror, had become the anvil. On the war maps in Berlin, red arrows grew like wounds. The generals knew there was no turning back. Kursk proved that the Wehrmacht was no longer the predator, it was the prey. The news of the defeat shook the heart of the Reich. Nazi propaganda tried to cover up the disaster, calling it a strategic retreat. But the soldiers knew the truth. Letters sent to families said it all. We have no fuel. We have no tanks. There are too many of them, and they don't stop. Kursk also marked the end of the era of German attacks. Never again would Hitler launch a large-scale offensive in the east. From now on, the whole war would be a bloody retreat. From Kursk to Kiev, from Kiev to Warsaw, and finally to Berlin. But for the Soviets, Kursk meant something deeper. Era revenge for Stalingrad, for Moscow, for every razed village and every dead family. The soldiers knew they were fighting not only for their country, but for the ghosts they left behind. And for the world, Kursk was proof that the impossible could be overcome. That an empire built on fear and force could be brought down by the courage and resilience of a people. The sound of engines, the roar of cannons, the smell of smoke and blood, all of it was gone. But the Kursk property continued to reverberate, crossing borders, controlling the course of war and the destiny of history. Years later, a Soviet veteran would say, "We didn't just win a battle. At Kursk, we broke the monster's back." And he was right. The monster would still roar, still kill, still burn cities. But he would never dominate the battlefield again. Kursk had shown the world that even the strongest steel bends before the will of a people who refused to fall. The weight of silence, the untold stories of survivors. When the guns finally fell silent, the true weight of the battle began to fall on the shoulders of those who survived. They were alive, yes, but carried hell within them. The men who fought at Kursk would never be the same. There was no medal, no speech that could erase what they had seen. The sound of the cannon still echoed in their heads. The smell of burning oil and charred flesh never seemed to leave his nostrils. And at night, when the wind blew, many swore they heard the voices of their dead comrades calling for help. Soviet survivors returned home covered in glory, but also in scars. Some had lost their sight, others parts of their bodies. But what hurt the most was what no one could see, the memories. Men who once laughed, sang and believed, now spoke little. Silence became the language of veterans. One of them, Nikolai, recalled, "I saw a friend's T-34 get hit and explode. When I ran over, the tank was still burning, and inside it there were voices. They screamed, and then nothing." He always stopped his story at the same point, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that only he could see. On the German side, the trauma was no less. The few who escaped the Battle of Kursk returned broken, physically and mentally. Veteran soldiers who had crossed Europe now trembled at the sound of an engine. Proud officers began to question what they were doing there. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered along with the panzers. Heinz, a tiger trader, wrote in his diary, "Kursk was the end of hope. There, I realized that the Reich would not win. We were fighting only to postpone the inevitable." The fields around Prokhorovka, months later, still bore the traces of the horror. Tank carcasses were slowly rusting. The trees were black, burned to the roots. And when the wind blew, dust mixed with human ashes rose. Returning peasants found skulls among the crops, pieces of metal among the wheat, and the old men said to the children, "Don't touch it, children, the ground still remembers." The Soviet government extolled Kursk as a triumph of the people, a landmark of national heroism, and it was. But the stories the soldiers carried in their chests were different. They were the untold stories, the ones the world would never hear because they hurt too much to be said. Some veterans have remained silent forever. Others spoke only of nightmares, murmuring names, orders, explosions, and there were those who became teachers, engineers, family men. but always with that distant look in their eyes, as if a part of them had remained forever in that field of iron and fire. Kursk was not over when the shooting stopped. She continued within the survivors, burning like glowing embers in the soul. Because no one really survives a hell like that. Just learn to carry the silence. The shadows of Kursk, the war that continued within the war. Even after the last shot echoed in the Kursk hills, the war didn't end. It just changed shape. The flames died out on the battlefields, but the echoes of destruction continued to reverberate in the hearts, in the cities, and in the Shah. Strategies that would shape the rest of World War II. Hitler, in his fury, refused to admit defeat. He summoned the generals to his presence, demanding explanations, blaming the rain, the tanks, fate, everything but his own arrogance. He had bet everything on Operation Citadel, believing that Kursk would be the blow that would break the back of the Red Army. But what he achieved was the opposite, broke the back of the German army itself. On the other side, Stalin celebrated. For the first time, the Soviet Union had not only resisted, she had won. And not just any victory, it was a crushing victory, won with blood, sacrifice, and strategy. Soviet morale soared. The soldiers, previously accustomed to retreating, now advanced confidently. The commanders, who had previously feared making a mistake, now knew they could beat the best Germany had. While the Russians buried their dead, the general staff in Moscow was making new plans. Every map, every route, every line of advance carried the shadow of Kursk. That battle had taught everyone how the enemy bled, and from there they would make the Reich bleed to the end. But for the Germans, the shadows of Kursk were like ghosts that followed them to all fronts. The generals lost faith in Hitler's orders. The soldiers, exhausted, began to fight just to survive, no longer for glory. The factories were no longer able to replace the destroyed tanks or the lost bodies. And those who returned from Kursk knew they had seen the beginning of the end. On the Eastern Front, the sound of Soviet engines began to dominate the horizon. The T-34, symbol of resistance, was now the harbinger of revenge. Every city retaken, every red flag raised, was a living reminder that Kursk had turned the tide of the war. But the shadows were not just military. They hovered over families, fields, and hearts. The destroyed villages still smelled of gunpowder. Mothers still waited for children who would never return. And the letters, many of them without an addressee, were still sent, like prayers lost in the wind. An old Belgorod peasant once said, "Before Kursk, we heard thunder and thought it was a storm. After Kursk, every thunderclap reminds us of cannons." This was the true shadow of battle, a collective trauma that spread throughout Eastern Europe, shaping the memory of an entire generation. And even as the Soviets crossed the Dnieper, advanced into Poland, and reached the gates of Berlin, many veterans knew it all began there, on the Kursk, dusty, blood-stained plains of Kursk. Kursk was not just one battle, he was a turning point in the soul of war. A warning to the world that power is not eternal, and that even the most feared army can be destroyed by courage, cold, and the will to resist. And as the sun set over the rusted carcasses and forgotten bones, the wind blew through the wreckage, murmuring a whisper that time would never erase. Here, men challenged hell, and hell responded. The legacy of Kursk. The day iron bowed to blood. Kursk did not end on the battlefield. She continued in the pages of history, in the memories of soldiers and strategic maps of all wars. The impact was immediate. The myth of German invincibility was destroyed forever. Hitler, who believed that his strike force could decide the war in the East, realized too late that the tigers or panthers, so feared, could not resist the overwhelming mass of the Red Army. Kursk showed that quantity, courage, and strategy could surpass the quality and technology. On the Soviet side, morale soared. The Red Army not only resisted, he turned defense into offense. From that moment on, the Soviet Union began to march westward, retaking cities, liberating occupied territories, and making it clear that the Reich no longer had the initiative. But Kursk's true legacy isn't just in the maps or the victories. He is in the blood spilled, in the fear that crossed generations, and in the courage that became an example. Civilians and soldiers saw the destruction, smelled the gunpowder, and walked among the dead, and yet they continued. The iron of the tanks bowed to blood, the plains became cemeteries, and the world realized that human resistance could overcome even the most perfect death machine. Kursk also redefined modern warfare. It showed that large-scale tank combat was possible, but that each strategic decision could cost thousands of lives. Engineers studied the fields, military personnel analyzed the formations, and war theorists understood that the future of conflicts would depend on coordination, logistics, and above all, human courage. For the survivors, the legacy was personal. They bore invisible scars. Some became heroes, others simply tried to rebuild their lives, bearing the weight of what they saw. And every soldier who looked to the horizon knew that Kursk had changed the world forever. Not just war, but the history of humanity. The Kursk field, with its craters, burned-out tanks and forgotten bones, remains as an eternal memory, a lesson in brutality, strategy, and sacrifice, a reminder that when iron meets blood, history is written at the price of life. And even decades later, when historians, filmmakers, and veterans look back on that summer of 1943, the whole world feels the weight of that battle. Because in Kursk, the war showed its cruelest face, and yet men survived, overcame, and taught that even in the most absolute chaos, courage can prevail. The end of the Cauldron, victory and the path to liberation. After weeks of incessant fighting, the hell of Kursk finally began to loose the temper. The fields of Prokhorovka and the surrounding area were still smoking, but the tide had turned. The Red Army, worn out, wounded and tired, remained standing, victorious, and Nazi Germany retreated, wounded and humiliated. What was once a relentless German advance turned into a desperate retreat. The surviving Wehrmacht trudged through the fields, carrying the wounded and trying to salvage what was left of their machines and reputations. But there was no longer any strategy that could save the pride of the Third Reich. The great Kursk Cauldron had consumed everything: men, tanks, morale, and hope. For the Soviets, victory was not just military, it was a symbol of resistance and determination. Every village retaken, every trench taken, every enemy tank destroyed, reinforced the confidence that they could push the invaders westward, liberating city after city. Kursk became a first major offensive that would change the course of the war, paving the way for the liberation of Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually the march towards Berlin. The field, now silent, was a living memorial. Twisted and charred tanks lay scattered for miles, a reminder that war takes an unimaginable toll. Bodies were buried, trenches cleared, but the scars remained, both on the earth and in the minds of the survivors. As the generals planned their next steps, the lesson of Kursk echoed in every decision. The courage and sacrifice of thousands of men can change the destiny of entire nations. Soviet soldiers, their uniforms torn and their faces sooty, stared into the distance. They knew that the enemy still existed, that the war would continue, but they also knew that the momentum was in their favor. The Red counterattack was underway, and the Nazi Empire was beginning to bleed beyond repair. Kursk, the largest tank battlefield in history, became an eternal symbol of resistance, strategy, and brutality. The cauldron that swallowed Hitler's dreams was now the beginning of liberation from Eastern Europe. And for the survivors, whether on the red or grey side, the memory of that battle would be forever engraved in the soul. The sun finally sets over Kursk, turning the sky red, not just from the blood spilled, but for the promise that hope and human resilience can triumph even in the most brutal circumstances. And so, the hell of Kursk ends, but its story will echo through generations, reminding the world of the price of war and the power of courage. The Battle of Kursk was more than a clash of tanks and armies. It was a test of human will, courage, and resilience. In those dusty, blood-soaked plains, men faced death, fire, and steel, and yet they stood firm. For the Soviets, Kursk marked the moment when defense became offense, when the tide of war shifted irreversibly. For the Germans, it was a harsh lesson in hubris. The myth of invincibility shattered under the relentless advance of the Red Army. The fields of Kursk still echo with the screams, the engine roars and the thunder of artillery. The cost was unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands of lives, thousands of tanks, and a landscape scarred forever. Yet from this inferno arose a legacy of courage, strategy, and unbreakable human spirit. Kursk showed the world that even the mightiest steel can bend to blood, and even the most fearsome army can be stopped by determination and sacrifice. It was a victory, yes, but also a reminder of the human cost of war and of the price paid for every inch of ground. As history looks back, Kursk remains the largest tank battle in history, a cauldron of fire and iron, and a turning point that shaped the fate of nations. Its lessons endure. Courage, strategy, and the resilience of the human spirit can change the course of history, even amidst the most brutal inferno.